What's up everybody, how's it going? It's Burke aka DansGreat here and welcome to the finale of Final Fantasy Crisis Core Reunion. I wanted to have like a final video where I review my experience overall and share my thoughts and feelings with you guys about the game. So generally these things are a nice sort of summary of everything that I've already talked about through the game, and sometimes as I'm going through these I come up with like different things that I might not have thought about during the initial run as well. And well, now I get to include basically the post-game and the side quest stuff as well that I couldn't include in my kind of initial reaction / mini review at the end of the story. So let's get into it and talk about Final Fantasy Crisis Core Reunion and what I felt about the game. So I think I'll generally start with big picture. I like to do that first because obviously not everyone has the time or the interest to kind of sit down for however long this is going to be and listen to everything. So honestly, this game kind of felt a bit difficult to review because there were lots of different aspects of it that I tried to consider. Giving it like one overall score for me was actually kind of hard. But as a mix of kind of lots of different scores and perspectives, I landed at somewhere around the 8 out of 10 mark. I would say like between 7.5 and 8 out of 10, I would say. But I'm going to give it an 8 for reasons I'm going to explain in a second. So the first thing for me was that, yes, okay, this is released on the PS5 on Steam. It's a Final Fantasy game. They charged a decent price for it. It's not absolutely as expensive as the brand new releases, but it should be viewed to some extent through the lens of a contemporary PS5 game. But of course we all know that really it isn't. It's a PSP game from 2011 from a tiny handheld console that's been given one hell of a facelift. So for me to kind of compare it to, say, I don't know, the likes of, you know, Elden Ring, God of War, Final Fantasy VII Remake, that kind of stuff, that just doesn't feel fair for this game. To be like, oh no, you know, this game sucked because it wasn't as long or it wasn't as visually detailed as Final Fantasy VII Remake or whatever, that kind of just doesn't feel fair. But by that same token, at the end of the day, it is basically a remake of that game. Square, if they wanted to, they could have put in even more resources to get it to that kind of level, and it is being played on a PS5 and they are charging a decent price for it. So to completely just like absolve it of absolutely everything and just say, well, it's a PSP game, so I'm going to rate it as purely a PSP game, then also I don't think that really works too. Because there were a decent amount of resources put into the kind of remaster / remaking of this game, and so it lands it kind of somewhere in between. And so for me, when I view it as like a pure PSP game, like if something very similar to this came out on, let's just say it was Switch only, or back in the day it was for PS Vita only, then I would have said this game is like a 9.5 out of 10, something like that, for those particular types of consoles. So for like the PSP and the handheld smaller consoles kind of thing, this game is fantastic. It really is. I do believe that. But if viewed through the lens of like a PS5 game where it's competing for console time with, you know, the big boys, the AAA games and, you know, all the bigger titles, then it's more like a 7.5 out of 10 in my opinion. So rounding it out, like it still lands for me as somewhere around an 8 out of 10, I would say. I played it as more of a PS5 experience than a handheld experience. So I think how it feels and plays on a PS5 and the overall experience of that, for me, weighs a little bit more heavily. And there's also like other elements of it that I think contribute to it being around the 8 out of 10 mark, which for me makes it a solid, good game. Now, historically, I do rate things fairly high. It's rare that I play something and I'm like, this was a 5 out of 10, because usually I'll just stop playing it. I think at its core, I just enjoy video games, so even when there's elements of a video game that I genuinely don't enjoy, I do like to look for the positives, and overall my experience is very rarely just like an overall negative. And so for that reason, even when it's a game that isn't like really, really good or brilliant or anything like that, I still give it around like the 7.5 to 8 range to say that I still had a generally good time with it. And it had some really, really good areas, and it had some that were notably poor as well. So let me break it down further here. I would say the biggest thing holding it back from me giving it like an 8.5 or even above that is the fact that the main story was too short, and the amount of missions and the amount of extra content that we have was basically just the missions really and the super boss. That for me just was not high quality, good extra content, and so for me it was very difficult to kind of evaluate that in a way that keeps the overall rating of the game high. So to break it down further beyond like the PSP versus the PlayStation thing, I also in my mind have to break it down between how did I experience the main story of the game, like chapter 1 to 10, take out all of the missions, take out all of like the fight in Minerva, all of that kind of stuff, take out all of the trophies, the platinum, any of that kind of crap, how was the experience of just playing through the story? That for me again was like, I would say 8.5 out of 10, something like that, 8.5 range. But the stuff outside of that, which contributed heavily to the overall playtime, was more like a 5. For me, it was just not very good at all. And so, again, when you kind of jumble up all of those scores together, I land at somewhere like 7.5 to 8 kind of range. So that's where I'm generally at with the game, I would say. Definitely a good game, I think. I'm really glad I did play it, and I had a good time with it. But there were some things that definitely I was not as happy about. But those things didn't make the overall experience, like the overall story playthrough of the game, diminish in any way, and that's what still holds up for me, and that's why I still definitely put it in the good game category for sure. So let's continue to kind of dig deeper and talk more about it. I would say the story portion of the game was one where, yeah, it was good and I had a good time, and for me, like, that portion is what really stands out for the game. But was it like a top tier story? Like, was the storytelling really great, and was like the presentation of the story done super well? Again, I don't think so. But what holds up the story for me really well was generally the cast. I do like Zack as a protagonist. Just the energy that he brings, and like he pulls off being this kind of naive, silly, sometimes stupid guy in like a charming and charismatic way, and that's something that's quite difficult to do. Like, when protagonists are a bit more like the happy-go-lucky kind of type of guys, sometimes that works really well, and sometimes it's really annoying when you're trying to tell like a hero story. And for this guy, I think it worked really well, and so Zack is definitely, I think, a strong point of the game, and so he like holds up a lot of the energy and the momentum of the story. But then I think for me, the world and the atmosphere of Final Fantasy VII is something I find really compelling. There's just something about the way that the world is constructed, and Midgar, and the Shinra Corporation, and everything going on there, and the science and the scientists involved, and you know, you've got like the live stream, and then you've got the alien like Genova, all of this kind of stuff. Like, when you bring it all together, for me it makes it a compelling world, and I've always been intrigued by it, and I do enjoy stories that take place in the world of Final Fantasy VII. So that was already one aspect. But then of course, the fact that you had the trio of Angeal, Genesis and Sephiroth really was the icing on the cake, because those three guys, they're so different to each other, but they're so cool in their own ways, and any scenes that involved them were generally really good, and I did enjoy seeing them, learning more about their stories and spending time with them. So that was like the core cast and the world of Final Fantasy VII really helps it hold up. And alongside all of that, there were just really good moments in the game that really heightened the experience for me. So, I mean, I'd known about the existence of that really epic FMV between Sephiroth, Genesis and Angeal for years. And watching it for the first time, it was one of the best Final Fantasy FMVs I've ever seen. It was just unbelievable. And I just could not believe that that was originally made for a PSP game. Like, the amount of time and resources they spent on making that FMV for like a tiny PSP in 2011 was just, it blew my mind. So that was like a moment. And then of course, as you get nearer the end and you have the finale with Zack and Cloud, the passing of the torch, all of that stuff, that was really, really powerful stuff. It was one of the most powerful endings to a Final Fantasy game that I've experienced. So you had all of that stuff. Then of course you had more of the story. So things that we knew about from Final Fantasy VII, but we lacked kind of the detail and the context and like the deeper understanding of how those events happened and where they took place and who was involved and what were they feeling at the time, how did it all play out. Seeing those kinds of scenes and those moments was also really interesting for me, and I definitely did enjoy that too. And I think, of course, one of the things that was one of the biggest standouts for me in terms of like the story aspect was getting to see more of Sephiroth specifically and what he was like before he finds out about his origins and basically starts to lose his mind and becomes like the villainous Sephiroth that we know from Final Fantasy VII. So seeing that side of him, the way that they further humanized him, he just seemed like a cool guy that you'd want to just go on missions with. He seemed like someone that you could definitely look up to as a hero, you could want to be like Sephiroth. And then to see how that all changed and collapsed was also really like, it added a lot to the overall experience and understanding, I think, of the story. And it helped round off Sephiroth a lot more as a character. So all of that stuff I thought was really good. Like the introduction of Cissnei, for example, that was a character that I didn't know about, and she was just like really cool, cute. She had her like, the fact that she had like the shuriken and all that stuff was really intriguing to me. and they left her in a really tantalizing way where she's like, I haven't even told you my real name. And I was like really hoping to see what happens to Cissnei in the conclusion of her story in this game, and it never really came. So she ended up being this enigmatic character, and at first I was like, that sucks. Like, I literally went into the Final Fantasy wiki to try and read up her story. Like, did I miss something about Cissnei? Like, what the hell happened to this chick? And it basically just says that after the events of Crisis Core, the rest of her story is kind of unknown. Like, you don't really know what happens to her in the end. So that to me was also really interesting. So ultimately, I think the cast and the world is what I generally kind of gravitated towards in this. It wasn't specifically what was going on with the story. Like, you know, you've got like Hollander and like all of this, you know, Project G, Project this, that, the other, and the DNA, and like, oh, Genesis's DNA can be like implanted into other beings and all this kind of stuff. I don't know, for me that side of it was a bit wishy-washy and it did lose me sometimes, so I can't say like that part of the story was really great, but I think like the bigger aspects of it, like the characters themselves and some of the themes that I kind of saw in the story were enough to make the overall experience really good. So another thing that I was thinking about and seeing a lot of during the story is how much of a victim everyone is to what Shinra's doing, and the scientists and their kind of very egotistical, maniacal at times aspirations. So Hollander and Hojo, like those two alone, they are such an important part of this entire story and set into motion so many events that have incredibly large repercussions later on in the story, that watching it was really like fascinating to see. And so everyone involved, like Zack, Sephiroth, Angeal, Genesis, they're all victims of what Shinra has been doing. And so even Zack, like for example, he's such a like hero, happy-go-lucky, he's fun, he's funny, he's cool, but then he's like, oh, you know, he's doing all of these missions for Shinra, and more often than not, he's just doing his job. He's not questioning what he's supposed to do. He's a soldier, so if he needs to find Wutai spies, if one of them's a little kid playing in a park and that kid's just going to be taken away by Shinra and arrested and interrogated and whatever they're going to do to that poor kid as a result of him potentially being a Wutai spy, he's okay with that. He'll just do that mission. He won't be like, wait a minute, like, I don't want to do this or anything like that, because he's a victim of this entire system. And so seeing these guys and what happened with them was really interesting. And even I drew some attention to it at the end. The way that Zack kind of passes on the torch to Cloud, and this whole idea of the price of freedom is steep, and Zack's like, once he actually finally achieved his freedom from Shinra, once Shinra cut their ties with him, he was free technically, but the price he had to pay was obviously ultimately the biggest price there is to pay. And so he never truly had his freedom. When he passed on his legacy to Cloud, and given everything that Cloud goes through and what he becomes as a result of his experiences, he doesn't really have his own fate and his own freedom either. Like, Zack kind of basically imprints his own legacy onto Cloud. And so Cloud's kind of destiny and legacy was not one that he really aspirationally chose for himself. It wasn't a free choice for him. The way that those events transpired, it's almost like a continued cycle of whatever Zack was going through kind of manifested and passed on to Cloud. So those kind of things I found really interesting. And like I said, there was a lot of cool things going on. Themes and ideas and characters and stories and that kind of stuff that really did interest me and provide entertainment throughout the experience. Now, where does it fall short? I think for me, like I say, the actual implementation of the storytelling I don't think was fantastic. And again, maybe that's a bit of a result of having less resources potentially for a PSP title. Trying to follow along with like what was happening to Genesis, like every time you think he's dead he appears somewhere else. Is this actually Genesis? Is it some kind of copy of him? What's going on with this? Like that kind of stuff definitely wasn't like the best storytelling I've ever seen, from my perspective at least. Then I think in general the story was too short. I think that was one of my biggest problems with it. Can you kind of give the game a pass because it was a PSP game? I think you can. To some extent you can. But when you're trying to evaluate it as a 2022 PS5 game, then it's kind of less of an excuse, I would say. So if I was playing this on the PSP in 2011, I would say that the story was a bit short. I wished it was longer, but I wouldn't have really kind of knocked the game for it. But if you're trying to re-release it in 2022, even if it is mostly a remaster, I think it deserves a bit more scrutiny. And I think it's a bit fairer to say that because it didn't have more, that it didn't reach the kind of expectation that you had for it. Now, because the game has so many missions, and I think a lot of people do missions as they go along, I thought the game was longer. I didn't really realize that if you ignore the missions pretty much, that the story was this short. I always thought that, okay, some combination of doing a few missions here and there, and the story, I thought it would take longer. Now, my playthrough was about 30 hours long before I completed the story, but a significant chunk of that was missions. I ended up doing a lot more of them than I would have probably ideally wanted to at the start, but part of that was because I was playing in hard mode as well. So when you take away all of the missions and all of the extras, the core story, just going from chapter 1 to 10, on normal difficulty, let's say, it's not going to take you more than like 13 to 15 hours. And well, we've all played enough Final Fantasy games to know that 13 to 15 hours for a Final Fantasy story is very short. Like, even the games I consider short Final Fantasies, they're in like the early to mid 20s in terms of the story, if you mostly push through with that. So it was about 50% shorter than most of the shorter Final Fantasies. So I think if your criticism of this game is that the story is too short, even though there are reasons for it and excuses you can provide for it, maybe valid excuses you can provide for it, for me at least it was too short. Now, if the story was longer, what would I have liked to see? I think the thing I still go back to is I still feel like we got a lot of cool characters, but at times we just didn't get enough from them. So I think the primary example for me was Angeal and Zack. Clearly they have a very strong bond, and there are definitely good scenes between them, but I would have loved for the introductory chapters to have been a bit longer and to have built more relationship with Zack and Angeal, showed us more flashbacks, had more maybe playable sections with those two together on a mission and that kind of thing. I felt like they needed to build up the relationship better than they did in the game. And so by the time you actually fight Angeal and you have to kill him, then I think it would have held a lot more weight. Like, when I look back on the game, Angeal's death just doesn't really strike me as particularly poignant, like compared to some of the other stuff that we saw. I felt like they could have done a bit more with that. So that's an example of something that I think would have benefited, and it would have stretched out the game. It would have brought the game to a more kind of conventional Final Fantasy story length, and it definitely would have added in a significant way. So I think that's something. And I think that general theme across most of the major characters, I think I would have liked to have seen. So I do feel like there was scope there for maybe like 3 to 5 more hours of main story. Like, not necessarily cutscenes, but just like an extra couple of chapters, let's say, that could contain some more kind of gameplay and story and dialogue and NPC talk and that kind of thing, that would have fleshed out those relationships a bit more and given us a little more depth on them as well. So I feel like there was scope there for more, but again, it probably goes back to the origins of it having to all basically fit into a PSP game, and so I do get it. And what we got overall I think was good, but it was definitely a little bit lacking, and it could have been executed better for sure. I think the dialogue was... Again, I was talking about implementation of it. I don't think the implementation was like A tier at all. The dialogue sometimes did feel definitely clunky, and again, maybe due to the PSP nature of it, there were like these kind of awkward gaps between lines, and like sometimes things just didn't flow together really well. I think thankfully like FMVs are really good in that sense, because they can kind of create them how they imagine them in their minds, and so the way that the FMVs play out, they're really top tier. But sometimes within the game itself, like the dialogues and the way things go, is not. I don't think the implementation was all that great. So the writing for like the actual dialogue itself and like the delivery and the style, I definitely don't think was one of the game's strong suits. But overall, I think there was enough charm and charisma there from the characters, and the other aspects of it elevated things enough that overall I think it was still good. But it does have some definite like things that were not particularly great. So for the voice acting, I'll say what I said from the start. I thought the voice acting was generally fine. Of course, my opinion on this is very skewed because I never played the original, but I totally understand if people who played the original are like, no, like the voice acting in this game sucked and it ruined it. It's very hard to get used to a casting choice for a character, especially like Zack, let's say, and then have him be someone completely different in a different game. So I do get it. And I'm not going to say that like, oh no, anyone who thinks his voice acting was bad is totally wrong. For me, it was fine. It definitely wasn't a detriment to the story. And I'm generally pretty lenient with voice acting. Like, for some reason, I don't know, I feel like the writing and the other elements of the scene tend to contribute more to how I feel about a scene. I think like the animation, the music, the writing, the general like pace of the story, all of that stuff. If all of that stuff is on point, even if the voice acting is like a 7 out of 10, 8 out of 10, generally it's still amazing. Like if the rest of that stuff is really good, the other stuff holds up. So classic example, Final Fantasy X. Does it have the absolute best voice acting ever in a Final Fantasy game? No, it doesn't. But is it good enough that it doesn't detract from the experience? For me, absolutely. I mean, it's still, for me at least, it's still the best story that I've seen in a Final Fantasy game. And voice acting did absolutely nothing to change that fact. So again, for this one, yes, was the voice acting absolutely top notch? I don't think it was, but it was definitely good enough for me, and I have no particular complaints about it, I would say. So that's the general like storytelling aspect of it. Definitely like a mixed bag, but overall I think positive enough that I would definitely put it in like the plus kind of category. So alongside this, I would say the more positive aspects, I think one of the most positive aspects of the entire playthrough was the gameplay. I genuinely enjoyed the gameplay. It was a lot of fun. It was like Final Fantasy VII Remake, whose gameplay I've praised endlessly already as, in my opinion, the best modern take on Final Fantasy gameplay that I've seen. But it was like that, but it was also like quicker and a bit more dynamic. And so I think recently I have been playing a lot more kind of action kind of games as well. I mean, I've played, before this, I spent a long time playing Elden Ring, Horizon Forbidden West, and God of War Ragnarok. So I was already in a bit more of an action-y groove, like a bit more rolling, blocking, dodging, that kind of thing. So if I had spent the last year just playing retro Final Fantasy or something, and then played Crisis Core, maybe I would have felt differently. But I had like a lot of experience recently with games that had a bit more of an action melee kind of style. So I think in that sense it suited me even more. But I liked the pace, I liked the dynamism, I liked the way they incorporated the magic, I liked the material that they had in the game, I liked the summons, like the summon sequences were absolutely fantastic, and the amount of variety that you had with the summons was cool as well. And ultimately the DMW system, I think, was definitely hit and miss. Ultimately, I think I kind of liked it, actually. Like, I think a lot of people kind of shit on the DMW system, and I totally get why. But it did keep, like, for a game where you only have one character, and there are definitely repetitive elements of the game, having, like, a randomized DMW that can shape the battle in different ways depending on what comes up, it does keep each individual battle a little bit more dynamic, because, of course, it can play out very differently depending on what you rolled on the DMW. So it's a double-edged sword. I mean, you do generally prefer some kind of control over your gameplay. And so if you want to summon, let's say, you want to be able to summon what you want and not have to think about like a random kind of summon coming along and hoping it's a good one. So I totally get that. But let's say, for example, like Final Fantasy XV's summon system, I really didn't like that. The summons themselves were really cool, but the way that they implemented them into the game, I just wasn't a fan. And this one I feel like actually does a bit of a better job, I think, with the DMW system on that front. And I think the main kind of reason I would praise the DMW system for me as well is because I've always been a bit of a sucker for when Final Fantasy games find a way to kind of integrate the story more directly into the gameplay. So it is a little bit of a kind of rough around the edges, crude way of doing it, but the whole like heightened emotions affect the DMW business I thought was really cool. And so that's the kind of thing I do like to see, and it doesn't happen that often, I think, in Final Fantasy games. The story generally is a separate entity from what happens within the gameplay. And so the way that they kind of integrated that a bit, and you have new people appearing in the DMW, and you see the memories through the DMW, you have the heightened emotions, I think it linked together in a pretty nice way. So I think overall I'm actually more positive on the DMW, but the randomized aspects and what that can lead to on like a more technical level, where let's say you need to roll a particular thing, so you know, this is jumping the gun a bit, but thinking ahead to like, let's say the 100% DMW trophy, or trying to get the Genji shield from the magic pot, that kind of thing, the DMW is a horrible system for that. And of course the variation it can cause in like when you get a level up or how you progress your materia, the uncertainty behind that, I don't like that either. And I don't know, I can't offer a better suggestion for how they could have worked that, but in general I think I like the idea enough that I understand where they're coming from with it, and it definitely added some positives to my particular experience with Crisis Core. So DMW, like, not as good as the gameplay itself, but I actually think it was a decent idea and thing to have in the game. So I don't have like a huge complaint about the DMW. So yeah, I think that was all good stuff. The boss battles were pretty good. Hard mode difficulty in general I think was pretty nice, and it did have some strange spikes. I mean, you saw the Angiel spike. I was pretty much going through the game at a relatively kind of steady pace, and then suddenly it just spiked up really heavily, and so I had to start doing missions in order to balance things out. Normal difficulty I feel like might have ended up being too easy, so hard difficulty I think for me was where it was at, and I don't think it's a particularly difficult hard difficulty. It's not like, oh, it's such a big challenge. I think most people could have gone into hard difficulty and would have been fine, especially if they were doing the missions as well. In that sense I thought it was okay. We did get plenty of like nice one-on-one boss battles with a lot of the major characters in the game. I would have liked to have seen a few things on like a bigger scale, but again that's probably just PSP problems I guess. So like the final battle against Genesis Avatar or whatever it was called was pretty nice, but I do think we had a fair few kind of, I guess, human to human battles almost, and it would have been nicer to see a few more like cool looking creatures or like fusions or mechs or something like that that could have given us a bigger sense of scale and epicness for some of the battles. So some of the battles I think did feel a little bit too small sometimes, but again probably a symptom of like the style of the game itself and the fact that it was on a small handheld console back in the day. Overall there weren't like that many amazing boss battles I would say. I think it was fine, but like nothing particularly standout I think on that front. The kind of mini games they introduced now and then were actually quite interesting. I didn't know what to expect with those, but even stuff like the sniper mini game I thought was like, I just wasn't expecting to see something like that, and so that kind of surprised me a little bit. And so the kind of little things that they threw in there now and then I thought were actually kind of cool, and for me at least it was a nice way to break up the usual type of gameplay that you have. So I kind of enjoyed that too actually, and I thought that was cool. So I think to kind of wrap it all up, I think those elements, so the gameplay elements that I genuinely enjoyed, and for a single player, like the whole way through you play with just one player, I thought was really good. And so combining that with the story that I thought was still positive, it really does kind of elevate it to a really good kind of level. And then on top, I actually thought the soundtrack was better than I expected, because again it was on like a smaller system. I thought like how much resources are they really putting into this soundtrack, and there was a lot of really cool stuff in there. Like I think there was a bit more of a, I'm far from a music person, but it felt like a lot of the tracks had more of a rock kind of touch, and I kind of enjoyed that. There was a higher kind of intensity and power to a lot of the tracks that I thought was really cool. So the soundtrack in general I thought was really good, so I enjoyed that. And then of course the final thing I would say in terms of the positives was the quality of the remaster/remake itself. It was definitely high effort. For me, it still goes down as more of a remaster than a remake. It's almost always a spectrum, like regardless of what they've done technically. Like you could tell me that every single thing for Reunion was done from the ground up, from scratch. Still, for me, it definitely sits like in the middle of the spectrum between a remaster and a remake. It's definitely a lot more than just throwing on a new lick of paint. They have gone to much higher effort than that. So having obviously the new voice actors, voice acting lines of dialogue that previously weren't voice acted, that kind of stuff is high effort. I think visually, like the models have been upgraded really nicely, and the game definitely does look a lot better than the original. And at times, it kind of almost competes with the AAA games of today. It's definitely noticeable for most of the game that you are playing some kind of remastered, remade game, but not enough that I would say, oh, it was lazy or it looks bad or anything like that. I think visually it was perfectly serviceable, and I'd be totally fine to kind of, let's say Final Fantasy VII Remake was this quality in 2020, but they managed to put like the entire game onto like one disc, basically, quote unquote disc, and have it as one game. I don't think I would have been like wildly unhappy or anything like that. I think it would have been like, yeah, like as long as the FMVs and stuff obviously were made properly and from scratch, so they looked better than they do in this game, I think that was perfectly serviceable. So I think like it's definitely good enough, and overall I think a lot of time and care was taken into trying to make this the best remaster/remake that they could without kind of touching the fundamental story, like not trying to add in like extra chapters or change the dialogue, change the story at all, or do anything like that. You know, add completely new areas, brand new bosses, all of that stuff. If you take all of that stuff away, I think they did a fantastic job. So could they have done more? Obviously, looking back on it now, in an ideal world, what I would have loved to have had is those extra 1 or 2 chapters. Like if it was me remaking the game and I had all the resources in the world and they were saying like, this is like, visually, this is the limit. Like, we can't do more than what we're doing here. But if there's anything you want to add in terms of the content, what would you do? I think for me, I would have added a bit more story. I would have put in like at least a couple of extra chapters. I would have stretched the game out another 3 to 5 hours, put in a bit more story between the likes of Zack and Angeal, maybe give Cisne a little more background, keep her potentially enigmatic, but give us a bit more. I didn't see any of Reno and Rude and what was going on with the Turks behind the scenes, so maybe some of the flashbacks that you see in the DMW, I would have turned those into like fully fledged sections of the game, had more playable sections maybe with some of the other cast members, that kind of thing. And that's the kind of content I would have loved to have added. And then I think alongside that, because the game has really fun gameplay and it has like 5 billion missions, I think I would have added more bosses to fight on like hard level. So there's definitely things I think could have been done, but what they did do I was generally satisfied by. And if you're looking at it through the lens of a PSP game kind of remastered and remade for late 2022, I think they did a really good job, and I was happy with that too. So overall for me there was a lot to like about this game, and I had a good time playing through the story. So yeah, that's like the main story portion, and the portion of the game that I think matters the most. This is like the lion's share of where my review score comes from, I think, and that's why I still kind of stand by giving it closer to like 8, even though I didn't have a good time with the missions and the other stuff other than that. So in case you didn't want to watch the missions, which I fully understand because there was literally like, what, 300 of them or something, and I would say 90 to 95% of them were very repetitive. So yeah, in case you didn't watch it, it's good to do a summary of the stuff that I didn't like. So first of all, I already mentioned most of the stuff during the story, so I'll quickly whiz by this stuff. But I do wish the story was longer. I feel like the main campaign was too short. I do think the writing and like the delivery / flow of some of the dialogue and scenes was clunky at times, so that could have done with some improvement. I do think in terms of the actual storytelling, sometimes I did get a little bit lost. It wasn't the best kind of, I would say, presented and explained story that I've ever seen. So that's something that I think could have been a bit better too. But that kind of stuff, they're relatively minor gripes, and it wouldn't have been enough for me to kind of dock that many points off the game, I would say. So that's the general stuff I think to do with the story. I would have liked a bit more boss variety. I think that would have been nice as well, like enemy and boss variety. So again, if you're making like a proper remake, maybe spending a bit more resources on creating more enemies and bosses would have been nice for this game. That's another thing that I think was a bit lacking. But I think the primary thing that I just wasn't happy with in the game was the way that they decided to design everything other than the main story campaign. It felt to me like there was just too much of a philosophy of, we just want you to keep playing this game at the expense of making it feel repetitive and tedious and at times just straight up boring. So it was like, we don't really care if it's not high quality stuff or innovative stuff or exciting or interesting stuff, we're just going to put it in there so that you can keep playing. So thinking back on it, obviously my initial reaction is that I hate that stuff and it sucks, and I just wasn't happy with the amount of missions and how repetitive and tedious they were. And then there was like kind of one thought I had that was like, this is, if someone said this to me, if I loved this game, like absolutely loved this game, and someone criticized it with that, what could I think of as a response? And for me, the primary response I had was, once again, the fact that it's a PSP game. And I think in this context that matters, because the only way I can think of that mission structure and the philosophy working is if what the game developers were thinking and their ideology behind the design was to say, okay, this is a handheld game, people might not be binging this game, they might just be playing it for like half an hour here and there on a commute or something like that. Now, I personally don't play my games like that, even handheld kind of games. I'm not the kind of person that just plays in like little mini sessions. I try to actually sit down and have a proper like 2-3 hour session if I'm playing something, and that's how it's always been for me. But I'm sure there's plenty of gamers out there that for a game like Crisis Core, you might not be playing it that frequently, and you're just kind of making little incremental bits of progress as you move along. So when you look at it through that lens, let's say you've played the story and you've really enjoyed it, or you're looking for something to do just when you have a timeout, like a half an hour commute to work, 20 minutes, whatever it might be, having these little missions to always go back to if you've enjoyed the game, I feel like it is a nice way to enjoy the game in those short bursts where you don't have to really commit yourself to anything. And so through that lens, yeah, okay, I'm gonna say that's fair. And it did kind of mitigate a little bit of the kind of distaste I had towards what they did. Not enough to wipe it away by any stretch, because at the end of the day, it's now released for the PS5. So if they really cared that much, if that really was their philosophy, and they were like, oh, okay, we thought of this back in 2011, but this is now going to be for a standalone console in 2022. Maybe we should make some tweaks to the mission system. Well, they didn't, so I'm not going to let them off the hook for it. But if that's your argument for why you think the missions were still really good and you really enjoyed them, then I think that's fair, and I will give you that. But overall, I would say, like, just the way that they designed it, the sheer amount of repetition, the amount of times you fought the same enemy over and over again, the way that they kept putting in those chests and forcing you to run around endlessly to pick up chests. So you would spend 3 minutes of a mission running around picking up chests, and then the battle itself could literally take 5 seconds. And the amount of times we had imbalanced kind of missions like that was just crazy. They kept giving you the same mission rewards and the same things in the chests. It was terrible. Like the amount of missions in this game and the repetition and the lack of innovation for most of them was terrible. So how would I have made it better? Because it's all good kind of just criticizing stuff, but I think if you don't have any idea of how to make something better, it kind of has a little bit less weight. And so, I don't know, thinking about it, the missions that were kind of better, for example, was the Yuffie missions. Why? Because they actually put a little bit more effort in. They had a little bit of an intro, they had a little bit of banter and interaction between Zack and Yuffie. They were fun, they were cute. And even though those missions also had their repetition, like every single time, I think, for one phase, it was like 7 missions in a row where you find the chest, and she was like, I don't want this piece of junk, and it was just the same line every single time. And so even that has its problems, but at least you could say that it was definitely, you know, a higher effort, different kind of mission compared to literally go to the caves, run around, find 7 chests, and then take 8 seconds to defeat a generic random encounter. So I would have had more missions like the Yuffie one. You had the Costa del Sol ones as well. I would have tried to find some more missions where you give like a mini intro to it. You try to link it in with some of the story or some of the areas. Like even reading the descriptions, at one point I was like, oh shit, maybe the mission descriptions actually offer a lot of interesting kind of premise and lore and that kind of thing, and because I wasn't reading them I was missing out. But then I did start to read them, and it's just the same shit over and over again. It's like, oh, there's Wu-Tai soldiers here, we need to eliminate them. There's Wu-Tai soldiers there, we need to eliminate them. We've got reports of more Wu-Tai forces here, let's go and eliminate them. And it's just like, well, no, that's not it either. So I would have had, I would say, half the amount of missions. I think half. I would have had more from, like, the Hojo's Lab ones were cool. The ones that are just singular boss battles where there's no running around getting chests. You just go in and you fight something and you try to win. I would have had a bit more of that, I think. There were a lot of bosses that they could have used there, like reused there, and they didn't. So I think I would have done that more. I would have tried to include some more, like, let's say M2 or M3 or whatever, that entire set. I would have halved the amount of missions, but I would have tried to include some little kind of bits of dialogue or little mini cutscene intros, something like that. And I would have spent more effort on the content of the missions than just kind of having just the same thing repeated so many times. So that's what I would have done. And I think the final thing I would have done is I would have definitely had a few more steps in the lead up to Minerva, because anyone who did watch the missions saw that I pretty much blazed through everything. Yeah, there were some things that I wasn't set up as well for, but after changing my setup, there was almost nothing that really caused me any kind of problems. And then suddenly you went to Minerva, which, despite having absolutely max stats, took me almost 100 minutes to defeat. So there was absolutely nothing in between. So I would have designed maybe the hardest, like 5% of the missions that were starting to increase in difficulty on the road to Minerva. So I would have had something with like 4 million HP, 8 million HP, 12 million, maybe like the highest one would have like 16 million or something, and then you make the jump to Minerva. So it would have offered a lot of cool boss battles along the way, and then Minerva would have still been a notable jump up, but it wouldn't be this like wild 100 times harder than anything you faced in the game so far. So those are the kind of ideas that I have off the top of my head, I mean, without sitting down and having a whole team of people planning it out. So I think there's definitely some stuff that could have been made much better for the missions, and it was one of the weakest parts of the game for sure. So that was poor. And of course you could say, well, why did you do them then if you didn't like them so much? But at the end of the day, there is the massive carrot at the end of this, which is getting to fight the super boss of the game. So I mean, if you're someone who wants to fight the super boss, it also sucks to say, oh, I'll just give up on fighting the super boss because I don't want to do the missions in the lead up to it. But if your approach to this game is like you're playing it on a Steam Deck or something, in 2022, 2023, and you just kind of, you've done the main story and you're just enjoying it in like little bursts on the train or something on the way to work or school or whatever, then sure, I mean missions are probably fine and you don't really have many complaints about it. But if you did binge it, like if you literally just spent 10, 15, 20 hours just going through all the missions from start to finish, and you still felt that the missions weren't really that repetitive and you flat out enjoyed that entire experience from start to finish, then you're cut from a different cloth than I am. Like that's fair. I mean, I'm not going to tell anyone what they should or shouldn't enjoy, but we just fundamentally have a different way of seeing the world. If you can play that many missions back to back and not feel that they're repetitive and that you retained your same level of enjoyment throughout, that's crazy. I salute you. But we're just different people in terms of our approach to gaming and what we want from a game. So that's my general view of the missions. Just definitely one of the worst aspects of the game, and the fact that it led to one of the more disappointing super bosses that I faced in Final Fantasy history also was not very helpful. So very abridged version. Minerva originally had 20 million HP in hard mode on the PSP version. For some dumb reason they upped that to 77 million, which I absolutely hated. Why a super boss suddenly has 4 million more HP when there isn't really a fundamentally different way to damage? Like, you can't do 4 times as much damage as you could in the PSP version, and so they've just done that. It's mechanically, I'm pretty sure the games are generally the same, and so it just takes 4 times longer. It's absolutely ridiculous. So the amount of HP they gave Minerva was the kind where it's like, yeah, you made it harder, fine, but you just made it way more tedious and less fun. Like, I didn't feel a euphoric sense of achievement when I beat Minerva. I just felt relieved, and honestly I don't think I want to feel relief when I beat a super boss. I want to feel like I've actually achieved something. So in that sense, Minerva I think was a poorly designed boss specifically for Crisis Core Reunion. I'm pretty sure if she had 20 million, a lot of my biggest criticism of it would have gone, and I would have enjoyed it a lot more as a battle as well. So yeah, it's harder than it was before, but for me it adds nothing and it takes stuff away, because you can make any boss you want harder. Like, you could just give Penance 100 million HP instead and be like, hey guys, it's the hardest Final Fantasy boss ever. But even Penance with 12 million starts to get tedious, and so giving it like 10 times more HP, yeah sure, it makes it much harder, but at what cost? So yeah, super boss was not my favorite, and again, because there was nothing in between it as well, there were literally no other difficult standout battles really that I can think of in like the mission / extra quest category. So you just have literally 300 missions basically, and only one of them contains a major super boss, and most of the rest of them are completely forgettable, stuff you've already fought and stuff that you can get through relatively easily. So it's just really poorly designed in my opinion. And I think the final word from there is going to be stuff to do with the trophies, and then I'm going to round things off. So this is the final kind of negative aspect of the game for me, and then I'm gonna wrap things up. Trophies are very hit and miss, and so I'm not going to criticize the game too much for having trophies that are missable. Almost every single game has trophies that you'll just miss on a blind run, so I'm not expecting to do a blind run of the game and just get every single trophy just because I'm quote-unquote careful or whatever. That's not that big a deal. But for me, I don't like the way that they don't have chapter select, so they've given you a really nice New Game Plus, which is good. But for a game that runs in chapters as well, just give us a chapter select, man. Like, you've got a lot of missable trophies. It's not just 1 or 2 that you have to be careful of. There's a lot of them, and they're scattered through the entire game. And the game demands that you have one save with everything that you need for all of the trophies. So you can't kind of pick some of it up from one run and then pick some of it up from another run, and just the act of picking it up is kind of registered and you get the trophy. So like, for example, for the mail, you have to do a run from start to finish and make sure you get every single mail sender in the game, and if you've missed even one, you have to run through the entire game a second time to do it. So that design I personally don't like, and not having chapter select definitely just wastes a lot of time as well. Instead of that, if they let you keep every single piece of mail that you receive, because I mean, you've already completed the game, you've met all of the characters, you've done the whole story, why not just keep all of your mail? Like, what do they gain by taking it all away? I don't understand. But giving you the mail, like letting you keep that in a New Game Plus, and then doing chapter select, you could very easily just meet the person that you need to get the final mail, and then it would literally take you maybe 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, instead of having to run through the entire game a second time. So we've all seen chapter selects. I mean, chapter select is not some big crazy idea that's never been tried before in gaming. So the fact that they didn't have one and they had the trophy setup that they did, I thought was really crap. So that's something I was not happy with. And I think the final thing for trophies was, again, going back to the general disrespecting of your time in this game. If you are playing this game handheld, let's say the Steam Deck is your only device for playing this game, and you want the achievement where you see every single DMW trophy. Now, leaving a console on for 8 to 10 hours to hope the DMW rolls the final memory that you're missing, that's shit, but it's more kind of reasonable. But really, like a handheld Steam Deck or something, I have to keep that shit plugged in for like 10 hours to see everything. No, like that just should never have been a trophy. I don't know what they would have done instead for that one. Maybe just give you the trophy for finding every single panel, but not necessarily activating every single memory. Because when you go to like a trophy guide and you kind of look up how to get a trophy, if the trophy guide's advice is to kind of set your characters and your materia up and then leave your console running, and hopefully within 8 to 10 hours you get everything, it's like, that's not right, man. It's not like I didn't play through the game. Like, I played through the entire game, I did every single mission, and I beat every single boss. After that, I still needed 10 hours of DMW rolling to get 2 memories that I needed. And well, maybe if I was unlucky, maybe I just wouldn't have got them for another 10 hours after that. So yeah, the DMW memory completion trophy thing was one of the worst trophies that I've ever seen, and it just goes back to that whole thing of endless, repetitive, shitty missions, despite the fact that I hugged the walls, and so I saved myself probably an extra 5 hours at least, just from encounters that I didn't face, because it would have been literally thousands of encounters that I avoided as a result of running along the walls instead of facing them. So that's the time that I saved. But the game kind of expects you to face all of those encounters because it doesn't give you a no encounters equipment, and it doesn't tell you that hugging the walls avoids encounters. So the game's fully expecting you to do 300 missions, and if you get, let's say, you're trying to get all the chests, there is absolutely no reason you should be getting less than about 10 encounters per mission, an absolute minimum. So 10 times 300 would be 3,000 encounters, give or take, obviously a big number, but you're getting the point here. It's an obscene number of encounters that you would be having if you did that as well. So add 3,000 encounters to my 42-hour game clock, then add 8 to 10 hours of DMW rolling, and then add playing through the game from start to finish one more time to get all of the missable trophies and mail sending that I didn't receive. Then you have hard mode Minerva, which involves either 100 minutes of making sure you don't make mistakes, running around, rolling, having the correct setup, guarding at the right time, and basically just concentrating for 100 minutes with the right setup, which is definitely not easy. Or you have to farm like a madman for Gil to throw at her for God knows how long. Or you have to farm a shit ton of SP to use like your Buster Sword stance and beat her in only 30 to 40 minutes. So that's a massive time waste as well. There's just a lot of, outside of that core kind of short story, there's just so much fluff and so much time wasting stuff that's been put into the game that, especially in this day and age, and especially for someone that's just got shit to do, like maybe if you're like 15 and you're just kind of, if your main thing in life is just kind of going to school, coming home and playing video games, and that's basically 95% of your life, then fine. But I think for most of us, especially most of us watching this video, time is of the essence. Like, when your time is well spent, you'll spend it playing games or doing whatever you want to do for a long time. I mean, obviously, I literally spent 150 hours playing Elden Ring last year, and I loved pretty much every minute of it. But this game, even though I technically only spent about 42 hours playing it, I would say like at least 10 to 12 hours of that felt like it was a repetitive chore. There was only maybe about 20 hours, I would say, like purely solid, like good content in there. And the rest of it was kind of just repetitive, filler, boring, grindy, uninteresting, uninspired, and just me also being able to avoid even more of that fluff by the decisions that I made. So I could have actively, for example, been playing the game and watching the DMW and making sure that I used the right limit break to make the DMW gauge higher, and maybe that would have taken me not 8 hours and it would have taken me 3 hours, but that's 3 more hours I have to stare at the DMW rolling and pressing triangle at the right time. So that's not something I want to do. The Gil farming necessary to beat Minerva with Gil toss very quickly, again, not interested in doing that farming. hugging the walls to not encounter things. It was just this constant fight between me and the game outside of the story for it to not waste my time. And so that's not something that I particularly enjoyed doing. I feel like I kind of won in that sense. Like it feels like it could have taken so much longer to do everything that I did with the game, but thanks to the kind of shortcuts that I was able to take and my general kind of refusal to let the game waste my time beyond the minimum, I feel like I came through it okay. But I would say that general element and everything that the game has as a result of it was probably the worst aspect, and that's why I would say, like, other than the core story, the rest of the stuff was like a 5 out of 10 for me. I think I genuinely didn't enjoy it that much, other than some small kind of sparks here and there. So unfortunately, like, that part of it was definitely poor. But as a first-time player of the story, I genuinely had a good time with it, and I'm really glad I played it. I'm really glad I waited for it. Years and years, people asked me for Crisis Core, and it was always like, should I just get it on emulate it on PSP? Sure, it'd be fine. And to be honest, I probably still would have enjoyed it just fine, for the main story at least. But I'm glad I waited. I always told people, like, this game is too big, and it seems like it's too good to kind of never leave PSP ever. And once the remake started, and Zack looks like he might feature more heavily in the next parts of the remake, I thought surely something's got to be happening. So when Reunion was announced, I was definitely very happy about it, and it was a perfect time to jump in. So for anyone that like never sees this review and we're just chatting about kind of Final Fantasy Crisis Core, that kind of thing, it's a 100% recommendation. Like, for me, every Final Fantasy fan I think should play this game, but your mileage may vary in terms of how much you actually enjoy it outside of the main story. I am confident that most people who just do a playthrough of the game on like normal mode, and they're just doing it more so to just play the main campaign, see the Zack, Sephiroth, Angeal, and Genesis story, I think most people are going to leave satisfied and they'll say it was a good little game. Especially if you get it later down the line and you pay a bit less money for it, and you're not really looking for like bang for buck, even if you only just spend like 15 to 20 hours max on most of the story stuff and then don't really play it because you didn't like the missions or anything, I think that's still money very well spent and you would have had a good time. But for people that are like, this is a PS5 game, it launched for like $40 or $50 or whatever it launched for, I'm taking time away from playing, let's say, God of War Ragnarok to play this instead, and you're the kind of person that likes to focus on a game. Like, you want to start a game and you want to finish everything you want to do with the game in like one kind of phase. So you don't want to just do the story, take a break for 6 months and then come back for missions, or maybe do some missions for like a week and then take a few months off, come back for more. If you're not that kind of gamer, then I think this game is going to be a bit more frustrating for you, and you're not going to feel like this game has deserved to kind of take the time away from the other major games that you could be playing. Then I think you'll most likely also be in that same boat of kind of doing the main story, starting to do the missions, and potentially burning out. I mean, I've already had like friends that have said that they've kind of burned out on doing missions for now, and they kind of stopped doing it, and that's very understandable. For me, obviously, being a content creator and being very motivated to reach the super boss, I definitely want to continue doing it. But I think if I was playing it purely casually, I think the chances of me not doing the missions and just kind of being like, you know what, maybe I just won't fight the super boss, I don't really care, it probably would have been higher. But obviously there is that element of, you know, I do have the YouTube channel, and I am known for trying my best to beat every super boss that I can find in a Final Fantasy game. So there is obviously that part of it that motivates me too, aside from just a personal desire to do it. But this game was one of those where I did come close to kind of saying, you know what, I might just not fight this super boss because I just don't want to do these missions anymore. But I kind of pushed through, and thanks to the continued viewership as well. I mean, it's not like everybody stopped watching once the missions began. I have been tracking the viewership, and most people are still enjoying it enough, even with the missions, to continue watching. And so all of that stuff kept me going, and I made it through to the end, and I did manage to at least add Minerva to the list. And well, it was literally one of the hardest bosses I've ever fought in Final Fantasy, so in that sense at least, Minerva in hard mode definitely delivered. So I'm going to round off there. Thank you all so much for watching this playthrough. It had been a long time since I did a proper like Final Fantasy playthrough on the channel, because 2022 was such a huge year for like non-Final Fantasy content. But 2023 is the year for Final Fantasy, my friends. I mean, most of this series has been uploaded in 2023 anyway. After this one, Final Fantasy 3 will be coming. I'll probably need a little break before I get started, because there's some Resident Evil stuff I would like to get to. But Final Fantasy 3 will be coming And then hopefully once that finishes, it won't be too long before the much anticipated Final Fantasy 16 arrives in late June. So it's going to be a big Final Fantasy year, and seeing the response for the start of the series, especially like the amount of people that tuned in for part 1 of this one was really satisfying to see. And it's always good to know that the hunger for new Final Fantasy content remains on the channel. So there will be more coming. Appreciate everybody for watching the series and for the support. Everybody on Patreon too. You guys have been huge. I will see you soon for more Final Fantasy content in the future. Take care.